This is a 1968 Super Reverb in superb clean shape. Aside from the output tubes and V5, the tremolo tube, everything in this amp is original. Now, you can see that the original filter caps are just now beginning to bulge. Let me get my pointer. Well, this will work. There's a little bulge starting there, a bulge starting there. Pretty good beginning of a leak there. That might just be discoloration, but there is a bulge here. This one doesn't have a visible bulge yet. Now what that is these caps dry out over the years, and the electrolytic material inside begins to dry out, and you don't have an even distribution. And I don't want to go too far down in the description and have people say, well, actually, that's the danger of trying to do an accurate summary, is when the more you summarize, the more things can be a little vague or construed as inaccurate. But it's essentially like an old 9-volt battery. You ever open up a remote you haven't used in years and there's all this white crud everywhere from the battery leaking? Well, that happens with these filter caps as well. These things were originally rated to last about 10 to 15 years. And these are in an amp from 1968, which has been a lot more than 10 to 15 years. And while they are still working fairly well, the amp is not especially noisy, they are beginning to bulge. And what can happen with these is when they do begin to actively fail, they're very active in how they fail. And they can spew their guts everywhere. They can literally explode. They can cause fires. I would strongly recommend to the owner to have these replaced, not because I need the money from another cap job, but because this is otherwise a very pristine 1968 Fender Super Reverb, which is one of the best amps ever, and it has the original CTS Alnico speakers. So everything that can be done to keep it as good as possible, in my opinion, should be done, because this is a predictable, preventable point of failure, and the amp would sound even better with new caps. Let's take a look at the insides. Well, this is just, I think, the cleanest example I've ever seen of an original 60s Fender. The board is immaculate. Everything still looks brand new, as if this were built just yesterday. Let me zoom in a little bit. I mean, look at the condition of that board. When you look at all the nasty things that have come in on Fenders in my channel over the years, and just the standard dirt and corrosion and warpage, this is just immaculate. All the solder joints are shining. No warpage at all. Nothing's pulled loose. All the solder joints on the sockets look good. The wiring is clean. There's that white dust that you get. That's a zinc oxide reaction. You can see where I've kind of rubbed it a little bit away with my finger. That cleans up pretty well. That is also in the tube sockets, so I'm going to clean all those. I noticed a lot of noise on V1 and V2, and I pulled those tubes out and just kind of used some compressed air on the sockets and put the tubes back in, and the noise got a lot lower. The tubes are still microphonic, but they're not noisy in the socket anymore. I think all the sockets need to be cleaned. Now, it has all the original electrolytics, and if I get to go ahead to change the filter caps, I will change all these cathode bypass caps as well. And I will return all these original parts with the amp, because while they are pretty, they are old, and they are all past their expiration date. Same goes for the bias cap. Even the bias board is still straight. Nothing is warped at all. It's very pretty. It has the standard at post 66 CBS ground studs, rather than having the grounds made directly to chassis, which is my preference. On an amp this pristine, I'm not going to insist on making that change. There's no warpage of the chassis from the transformer, which is what undoes these grounds. I have tightened them. They tighten up well. It has the original 2-conductor ungrounded power cable, which I should have had ready to show you. Let me pull this up. It's got a long power cable. It's taking a while to get to the other end. This is very pretty and wants to kill you. More on that in a moment. Has all the original components on the output sockets, and the chassis has no discoloration from heat, which is rare. Now those screen grid resistors here and here are 1-watt carbon films. Those are carbon composites, and they tend to bake in that location because they are directly over the tube sockets, directly over the tubes, and all the heat from those tubes, which is considerable, rises up. I'll measure them. In general, I prefer to replace those 1 watts or 3 watts mounted to the side. But if they are still operating well, that'll be the owner's decision. And I'm not going to change a thing unless I'm also allowed to change the grounded power cable. Change the power cable to a grounded one. More on that, as I said, in a moment. All original pots. Everything frighteningly clean. The ticket when this amp came in just said clean pots. And he was right, they were all scratchy. No DC was present, so that's good. And I cleaned them and lubricated them. I used D5 to clean them and F5 to lubricate them. And I tightened the input jacks and the speaker jacks and the RCA jacks. And I cleaned the contacts here on the RCA jacks, especially important on the reverb connections, because there's quite a bit of current on the send. And so you want that to be very clean. And I made sure when I cleaned that the cleaning fluid, in this case some more D5, did not get all over and discolor the panel here. That zinc oxide white dust, white rust people call it, is fairly much everywhere and even, but I can clean that off, but it's just a waiting game. It will come back. It's just the way the coating on the chassis interacts with oxygen over the years. No big deal. And in areas like this, if he wants it clean, areas like here where the stamp is, I would use a brush rather than any solvent, even a mild one. But aside from points of chassis contact or inside tube sockets, that zinc oxide really isn't a problem. And if you rub it on your nose, you won't get sunburn. Let's talk about ungrounded power cables, 2-conductor power cables versus grounded. This amp from 1968 has the original 2-conductor ungrounded power cable, which would be illegal to sell today for very good reasons. Number one, the amp will be quieter and operate more quietly in terms of background noise if the chassis is at true AC ground. You will have better shielding. The ground currents will be much more predictable. Everything is improved audibly if the chassis is at true ground. But possibly more important than how it sounds, it will be much safer for you, the player, the owner. Right now, with this 2-conductor plugged into the wall, but the amp powered off, with 120 volts coming out of the wall here today, I can measure between the chassis with this red lead and ground in the outlet with the other lead, the black lead. And in this position of the ground switch, there is a potential for 0.27 volts AC between chassis and ground. I flip the ground switch. It goes up to almost 118 volts potential. If I power the amp on, it goes up a little bit more, almost 119 volts, and that's going to vary between 117 and 120 typically. This is with the amp on, but in standby. If I flip the ground switch again, what used to be 0.27 volts is now 1.5 volts. But let's focus here on the other position, almost 119 volts potential between the chassis and ground. Now, if you plug a guitar into this amp and you are touching its strings, as we almost always do, your hands are touching the chassis of this amp. So if you then touch a microphone on stage, which is grounded, if you touch the strings of your buddy's guitar or bass and they're plugged into a grounded amp, if you touch a keyboard on stage, all numbers of things in your environment which are grounded, and there is a potential voltage and potential current from this amp to ground, it will go through you. And it happens to people all the time. My friend in Brooklyn just bought a mid-60s Guild amp with the same power setup as this Super Reverb, with ungrounded power cable and what's called the death cap between the polarity switch and chassis. And on his, it sounded great in the shop. He brought it home into his studio. He plugged it into the wall. He powered it on. He plugged his guitar into it. And then he went over to turn on his Peterson tuner in his studio. And he was holding his guitar. And he had his hand on the strings with his left hand. And he went to touch the tuner. And the tuner was plugged into another amp in his studio, and that amp was grounded. So the Peterson was grounded through the other amp, and the input jack on that tuner, he's probably just pushing a button to hear it audibly, but he touched something metal on that Peterson, which was grounded, and he got shocked. Now, what's the difference between his amp, which has the same circuit, where he did get shocked, and he measured 116 volts AC from chassis to ground in that situation, because he called me and I talked him through testing that. And this one, where I'm measuring 119 volts. The difference is that right now, at this moment, this amp will not shock you, or you will not notice that you have a current through you, versus his, which was painful and dangerous. You're trusting a very old, 60-plus-year-old film cap with a high DC rating and a very low substandard AC rating. And the reason I know that this amp will not kill you right now is because I measured not only the potential AC voltage present, but the potential AC current present. And right now, it's only about 300 milliamps, which is not enough for you to even feel or hurt you. I'm not going to get into measuring AC current with a meter because there are lots of gotchas to it. It gets complicated. You can damage your meter, and this is not going to be a how-to video. But I did confirm before I worked on this amp any further that this chassis was not going to kill me in its current state. My friend's will, this one won't yet, because his death cap failed. The death cap in this amp has not failed yet. It's a matter of time. It is literally a ticking time bomb. It is a bad design, which is illegal for use today, and it is so easy to change out. And yeah, it will have a new power cable, and the wiring for the AC connections will be slightly different than it was when it was new. And so from a collector's perspective, oh, that's a terrible, terrible thing. My God. If you were going to own the amp and look at it and say, it's all original, fine, don't plug it in. If you want to play the amp, and you want to play the amp and have it sound its best, and if you want to play the amp and know that it will not kill you, please have a proper grounded 3-conductor power cable installed, because the tone of the amp with the new cable will only be better because the noise floor will drop. You will not have any potential AC between the chassis and ground, which means that there will not be any potential AC between you and ground. And if there is no potential AC, there will never be any potential current. Right now it's 300 milliamp. So, most people would not know that there is a problem, and people think that if there's not a problem now, there never will be. People can be optimists about the worst things. As a tech, I have to be a pessimist. Most amps that come in, vintage amps, I refuse to do anything on if the owner will not allow me to put it on a grounded power cable, because I don't want to do any work on an amplifier and then 6 months later they get electrocuted and their estate's attorney comes after me and says, my client owned that amp for 20 years and never had anything bad happen until Mr. Caldwell allegedly serviced the amp. So on this amp, as it stands right now, the only things I've done are cleaned the pots, and I'm going to clean the tube sockets. And I'm not going to even heat up the soldering iron, in which case I have not made any changes to the amp, and the owner can take his chances with the original filter caps, the original electrolytics everywhere, and the ungrounded power cable. I hope that the owner will allow me to change all the electrolytics in this amp and to change the power cable. Because it will protect everything else about this amp. Once you remove the points where failure can be catastrophic, then the rest of the original amp can remain beautiful and sound fantastic and will not degrade. Nothing bad can happen. But unless I get the authorization to change those filter caps and the grounded AC cable, I'm not touching a single solder joint in this amp. I'm not doing anything which can ever be called a change, because I don't want any liability from this very unsafe power structure. I know I've gone on at length about this, and I know it's not the most exciting part of amps, but it is so, so crucial to understand. I cannot repeat enough. Just because there is a very small potential current today does not mean that there will be a small potential current tomorrow or next week or next month or next year. This circuit will fail, and when it fails, it will become dangerous. That's all there is to it. Okay, I removed all the tubes and I've cleaned the tube sockets, and while I'm waiting for them to dry and then to hear back from the owner as to whether I can actually do any service on this amp, I took a measurement of all the resistors in the amp. Side note, I got into a debate with a guy not that long ago who insisted that you cannot measure resistors in circuit, which is hogwash. You can measure resistors in circuit, not while the amp's on, but, and if you have situations where things are in parallel, like the 470K, 220K in the reverb mixer position, which is going to be affected by the position, the setting of the reverb pot. If you know where you're going to have parallels, that's not a big deal. But especially when it comes to plates and cathodes, you can absolutely measure resistance in the amp with things connected. And anyway, I digress. Everything I measured is well within the expected plus minus 20%, mostly plus. So a plate resistor was supposed to be 100K, might measure 103 to 118K. That's normal. But the two resistors, one in particular, that really do need to be changed in this amp are crucial ones. So they're the plate resistors and the phase inverter. And this one's supposed to be 100K, and this one's supposed to be 82K. If I measure this 100K, about 125K, so just over 20%. That one's debatable as to whether that's out of spec or not. It's at the high range of the drift that I would accept. But this 82K measures 162K, 161.9. So that's double the value. And that is 100% drift, 200% drift, depending on how you think about it. It is a sign of a resistor which is running away from itself. It is no longer going to be anything like it's supposed to be in terms of its performance. It's going to get worse and worse. So that resistor is physically bad and unreliable. And an 82K, 100K, which is the design spec, is chosen that way to offset the difference on the two sides of the output. And if you have 160K and 120K, that balance is going to be way off, and the amp will not perform as intended, to put it nicely, and that problem will get worse and worse as this resistor continues to fail. That's not just drift anymore. It is actively failing. It could eventually go open. So I would really like to change both those resistors, or at least the 82K. But like I said, unless I get the go-ahead to at least put in a 3-conductor power cable, I will not change that resistor because I will not touch any solder joints in this amp due to liability issues. So let's see what the owner says when I do get a chance to speak to him. I've cleaned all the tube sockets, and the next thing I've got to do is clean all the tube pins where necessary. The preamp tubes were all in pretty good shape, but these Ruby 6L6s have got some gunk there, so let me clean that off before I put those in the sockets. Gunk is never your friend. Much better. Ready to go back in.